Explore DDD, right? How about this event? This is, out of all of the events that I've gone to every year, this one, I dig. I love it. I think what Paul's done here is amazing. I think the getting to interact with movers and shakers, with smart people who are thinking about the same things that I like to think about, language and domains, and getting aligned with business, it's really cool. Getting to think about services and boundaries and all of that kind of stuff, I really, really dig it. And so we talk a lot in domain-driven design about language, right? Eric's keynote last night was about language, right? Primarily about language. This is going to be another talk about language. We're going to talk about the words that we use and their meaning in the context of how we interact with our teams, how we interact with our business counterparts, the domain experts that we deal with on a daily basis. Now, I want to take a moment and go back in time to last year. Last year's Explore DDD conference, right? Eric Evans gave the keynote again, as he did the prior year as well. Last year, in his talk, he was talking about domain-driven design itself, right? The definition of that term, the language that we use to describe this thing that he put into book form, and he kind of said that, there are some compromises that we make, right? That if we define the term too tightly, right? Domain-driven design means this, and that's that, right? Then we don't have a lot of the interaction, the back and forth, figuring out what it really could be, right? If it's defined too loosely, which perhaps could be argued that that is the case. I was talking to a friend that I was going to be coming to this conference, and he was like, well, I hope you learned something because domain-driven design is a term that has so many meanings that it doesn't have any meaning. And I think that's a danger with so many of the terms that we use in software, right? Service. What does service mean? Well, it can mean anything, which means it means nothing, right? So, when we try to talk about things, we try to get on the same page. So what Eric said in that keynote last year that I thought was really insightful was, well, we need to find a balance between those forces, right? It can't be too tight, it can't be too loose. And he went ahead and put forward kind of a 3-point, I'm not clicking here. Oh, now I am. Went a little too far, sorry. So he put together kind of a 3-point definition of what domain-driven design is. These are kind of some of the core tenets that make up what it means to be domain-driven. And that first one is that, hey, right, we've got complex domains. We are tackling complexity in the heart of software, and so we've got to compose our solutions and view our domains as being composed of subdomains. And we're going to have that one core domain, that one thing that makes us different, the one thing that makes our business what it is. That's our core domain. We want to focus on that thing, and that's useful, right? And he also said that, hey, we've got this creative collaboration going on, right? Poetic language, right? It's alliterative, right? Creative collaboration, and it rolls off the tongue. It's appealing, and I dig the way he put that. Domain practitioners and software practitioners. Interesting choice of language there. We're going to come back to that, okay? Then the other thing is speaking a ubiquitous language, right? This is one of those things that, these two things, right? When I think about domain-driven design, when I think about what are the key takeaways of the Blue Book, well, it comes to these two things that are in that last point, right? I think about ubiquitous language, I think about bounded contexts. And so we put those together into this one, and I think it's interesting too, this relates very much to his keynote last night, talking about that terms have a meaning inside of a context. And so that this kind of spells out a little bit that the ubiquity of your language applies within a context and not broadly across the whole thing. So I think with this definition, Eric gives us a lot. To me, the key takeaways from domain-driven design are summed up in this definition with these 3 points, especially that last point. I really love that. Of course, the first one as well, focusing on that core domain, okay? But today, I want to talk about language, and I want to talk about this part in that second one, right? A creative collaboration, right? Again, poetic language, and I dig it, right? This though is interesting words here. Software practitioners and domain practitioners. What do we mean by practitioners? And let's think a little bit about, well, where did this language come from? If you go to Wikipedia, you're going to see these same 3 points out there on a definition, but it's stated a little bit differently. Okay, and this language, I think, actually came from Eric. He gave a talk 5 years after he had written the book, and you can go find that on the YouTubes. Oh, by the way, at the beginning of the talk, I meant to mention this. I had a GitHub URL at the bottom of the opening slide, and I've got that slide duplicated as the last slide. That GitHub URL is the repository that is these slides, and it also has a README in that repository that has links to the stuff that I'm mentioning here, right? So that Eric Evans talk, what I've learned since the book, I've got that linked in that README. So any of these things that I'm mentioning are accessible there. So that's going to be, again, the last slide, and so you'll see that GitHub URL. So it's my ID/expert is the repository for these slides, right? So it's both the slides and the links. So in that talk, I think that was the source. I don't know for certain that this was the original source for where this language came from, but it's, and I'm pointing at this like you can see that, right? This language about domain experts and technical experts, right? I mean, this is basically the same statement, right? The same creative collaboration, but instead of talking about practitioners, we were talking about experts in this older version of this language, right? And so last year, in the keynote, Eric changed experts to practitioners. I think that's significant, right? Eric Evans, out of anybody that I've ever been around, is very careful with the language he uses, right? Domain language is the name of his business, and he emphasizes that throughout both the Blue Book and pretty much everything you've ever heard him talk about, right? Including last night's keynote, which was wonderful, by the way, right? So Eric saying, I'm going to use this term practitioners. I don't think he made, a big hubbub about it. Didn't really emphasize that. But what's on Wikipedia, and I think I've seen that language too. Technical experts, domain experts, right? I think I've seen that on the domain language site itself. Don't ask me for chapter and verse on that, but I believe it was there. Right, so this is Eric's terms, and in fact, right, I went and looked at the Kindle edition version of the book, and I don't expect you to be able to read this. I just wanted to show you that I was looking at the Blue Book in my Kindle for PC, and I did a search for domain expert, and it appears 102 times in the book. Right, so this is something that Eric talked a lot about, is domain experts. So that language, that shift in language at last year's keynote, I think he may have preempted a little bit some of the things that I have to say in this talk by using a different word. And I think it's significant, right? And when Eric Evans uses a word, I think there's always a meaning to the words that he chooses. So, he's around here, so maybe we'll ask him about that at some point in the course of the conference. But I think that shift from expert to practitioner means something. So we talked about domain experts a lot in domain-driven design, and we still do, right? We're collaborating with domain experts. Again, at last year's Explore DDD, there was a lightning talk given, right? We went through this exercise of folks getting up in front of the room and giving 5-minute talks. And one of the talks had kind of a bit of a theme saying, there is no such thing as an expert, right? And that's echoed by, okay, I'm using the keyboard instead. That's echoed by this guy, James Altucher, right? And I don't expect you to read this. I'm just kind of showing you that this was a Quora answer that somebody out there asked a question about, experts and laymen and should there be some dichotomy between these answers so that when you're reading something, it's coming from an expert. James Altucher, who is I don't know exactly how to describe him. He's a guy who knows a lot of things about a lot of things, essentially. So he's written a lot of books, and he at least presents himself as knowing a lot of things about a lot of things, and I think it's justified in a lot of cases. So he said, there's no such thing as an expert, right? That same sentiment that I heard last year in the lightning talk at Explore DDD. And I think that's an interesting sentiment, right? It's an interesting assertion, and it has a point, right? I want to push back on it a little bit, but before we get there, language is important, of course. So if I'm thinking about a term, what does this thing mean, right? The first step is the dictionary definition, right? So what does it mean to be an expert? right? Somebody who's an expert in a given domain, that's a person that I want around me when I'm trying to write software for that domain, of course, right? And when I'm lacking that expert, that hurts my ability to be able to model that domain effectively, right? So this definition tells me something about what it means to be an expert, but I don't think that necessarily helps me know what I really should be thinking about that term. So we here are DDD practitioners, right? And I'll make the argument that domain-driven design and behavior-driven development, these, XDDD practices, XDD, okay? I put too many Ds on that first time, right? But these kinds of practices, I think BDD and DDD fit like a glove. There's a lot of great collaboration, behavior-driven development done right, where it is a collaboration of the three amigos, if that's a term you're familiar with, coming from the Cucumber book, about that the different roles in an organization coming together to collaborate on what the software should do, right? In BDD, we say, well, let's think about examples. Right? So behavior-driven development, acceptance test-driven development, specification by example. I'd argue that those are mostly synonyms with some subtle differences, but generally the idea is examples to specify what my system is supposed to do. Okay? So with that in mind, let's think about examples of experts. Okay? So if I ask you to close your eyes, and you don't necessarily have to, but if I ask you, think about examples of experts, what are some of the images that come to mind, right? I imagine a lot of folks probably picture this face as an expert, right? Or maybe, hey, we're all software engineers here, computer scientists, to the extent that those terms are interchangeable, which they really aren't. But maybe we think about some of our forebears in the world of software and computing and some of those things, right? Maybe some other names like Martin Fowler and some of the other awesome folks that have blazed the trail, led the way, right? DDD folks, right? We're going to see this face, right? Is this guy an expert? Well, I certainly think so. Maybe you think about a Portuguese footballer, right? What we here in the U.S. like to call soccer player, right? That's a translation from another culture, right? So yeah, this Portuguese footballer, certainly a master of his craft, right? Seeing this guy take a penalty kick, it is a done deal, right? It reminds me of Larry Bird, right? When he would step to the free throw line and game's on the line, it was over, right? His team wins. That was all there is to it. So I think that's a sample of an expert, right? Here's another, right, from fiction, right, as we start to think about these worlds, these galaxies that have been constructed in the minds of people who have lessons to tell us, right? Here's somebody who had a lot to offer as far as teaching young Skywalker to become what he could be, right, to realize his potential, right? Was this guy an expert? Okay, but yes, Yoda's an expert. He's an example of an expert, but imperfect too, right? If we think about the prequel trilogy, right? We think about how the Sith Lord was under the nose, right in front of his face the whole time, and he couldn't recognize it, right? Clouded the Force is, right? He couldn't tell what was going on, even though it was happening in front of him. So, this guy was an authoritative source of all things Force, right? He knew what was going on, but he didn't know everything that was going on, right? Some other examples of experts, right? And I put these guys on the same slide because they're very similar stories, right? These guys are revolutionaries in the way that we deal with disease, right? Pasteur, well known for a lot of things, right? Including heating wine and milk and all of those things to kill microbes inside of it and that stuff. Also, vaccination, right? He was the source of modern immunology in terms of using weakened strains of microbes to gain immunity to those same types of microbes. The story of discovering this was that he had some cultures of cholera that he was giving to chickens, right? And through a mistake, I think it probably was one of his assistants rather than he himself, but some of the cultures got old, right? They didn't use them in a timely fashion, and they got weakened, and they tried to kill some chickens with cholera, and it didn't work because these cultures were too weak to actually do the trick, right? And they went ahead and reused those chickens in later experiments and found that they couldn't kill those chickens, right? They had gained immunity to the cholera that they were injecting them with through this accident, right? So Alexander Fleming, right? It's a similar story, right? The discoverer, the father of antibiotics, right? Discovered penicillin. He had been growing bacterial cultures in petri dishes and just left a mess in his lab, didn't clean things up. Mold started growing on his stuff, right? And he accidentally discovered that where the mold was growing, there weren't any bacteria because the mold was putting out something that was killing the bacteria, right? Accidental discovery, right? Are these guys experts? They changed everything, right? Lives got better because of their contributions. I think that qualifies them as experts, but, right, they're imperfect experts. And I think that's a bit of the assertion related to experts is that, hey, people are imperfect. When you are dealing with your domain expert, right, they don't know everything. When you go and ask a question about how should this particular feature behave, right, what is the model that I'm dealing with in this domain, they might not know, right? They might tell you, I don't know. Or worse, they might not know, and they'll tell you something as though they do know, right? It's a familiar story, right? And it's hard to understand your domain because you're dealing with humans who don't have complete knowledge. Wouldn't it be great, right, if you had, the ultimate artificial intelligence that knows everything that you need to know and you can just go ask it your questions and you get the answers that are going to guide you in modeling your domain. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And hence the assertion that there are no experts, right? And when I look at this definition, comprehensive and authoritative knowledge, that's a high bar. Comprehensive knowledge, that's basically saying you know everything, right? Authoritative, I don't necessarily have a terrible problem with. It bothers me a little bit to say authoritative, but I think that's something else where we can apply the idea of the language is specific to a bounded context, right? If if Eric Evans walks in the room right now and I say I'm an expert on domain-driven design, well, the bounded context just changed, right? If Eric's in here, I'm not the expert on DDD, right? I'm probably not anyway because there's a lot of smart people in here who know a lot about this, right? But in a given context, right, when each of us goes back to our relative homes and we walk into our office where we're working with the people who we know, right, who, most of the time, we're the expert in that context. Most of the time, we're the expert related to software, I should say, related to domain-driven design. So it's context-specific as to whether you are an authoritative source of knowledge, right? Am I making sense? So comprehensive knowledge, though, that's impossible, right? So, I think everybody has knowledge that is incomplete. As we like to say here in Denver, right, at the Broncos games, incomplete. And most of you aren't from Denver, so you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, unless you've seen it on TV where you hear that in the stands after an incomplete pass. So anyway, yeah, knowledge is incomplete, right? Nobody has comprehensive knowledge. So if it is prerequisite to be an expert, to have comprehensive knowledge of something, right, except for the most trivial of things, okay, no experts, right? But I don't know that I like that, right? I mean, when Eric's talking about domain experts, expert in a context, I think, is something that we should consider, right? When I go and talk to people who know something about, say, insurance, right, or payments, or shipping, right, those people know things that I don't know. Relative to me, they are experts. So we don't have any perfect experts. We don't have any perfect models of our software either, right? Paul Rayner is fond of this quote. I've heard him say this probably more than I've heard anybody else say it. But yeah, all models are wrong. Some models are useful, right? So I think the standard that we're looking for related to the models that we use in our software, as well as to our domain experts, as well as to our software teammates, right, is utility. Not necessarily that they need to have comprehensive perfection. And really, all of software modeling is an exercise in incremental improvement anyway, right? So I would say that's also true of life, right? As you have more experiences, you refine your understanding of the world and the way it works, and that's it, right? You get better. You get better over time, okay? So we don't have perfect domain experts. And that's sad, right? We wish we did, okay? But while we're pointing our fingers and saying, hey, my domain expert doesn't know his stuff, right? We've got to think about that we've got some fingers pointing back at us too, right? When's the last time that you wrote a system and didn't have any bugs in it, right? When's the last time you didn't overlook something? You didn't misunderstand something that should have been there in the domain model, right? Software developers are just as bad, right? The wisdom of Socrates, right, is the idea that, the true wisdom lies in knowing that I know nothing, right? Which might be a little bit hyperbolic, right? You probably know something. I think there is a bit of a philosophical argument to be made that do you really ever know anything, right? You have varying degrees of certainty on the things that you think you know, right? Some of them approaching one, right? I think that everything you know is probably with some at least minute degree of uncertainty, but that's a little bit beside the point, right? So I think you could take the statement that wisdom lies in knowing that I know nothing to either be true, but maybe stating it too strongly, or you could even argue that it makes a lot of sense. But, right, we software experts, right, if we dare to use that term, right, it sounds very pretentious to say that we are experts, but, in a given context, I think it's okay to use that term. In a context where you are dealing with domain experts, people who know something about whatever it is your business does, yeah, you're probably the software expert, and they are probably the domain expert, right? That person has something to offer to you. You have something to offer to them. Further, I want to talk a little bit about skill acquisition, right? One of my favorite development bloggers in the world is Eric Dietrich, and this guy's just got a way of writing that just drives a point home. If you don't read his blog, you should. It's that good. He made this insight about the DReyfus model of skill acquisition as it relates to software developers, and not necessarily only to software developers, but he was applying it in a developer context, and his point was really great. So before getting to his point, the DReyfus model is just this idea of there are various stages of skill acquisition that we go through. So as we start to do something, right, there's a period where we're a complete noob, and over time we start to ramp up to the point where we gain some degree of being able to do the thing. I'm thinking mostly of my daughter at this moment and her acquisition of violin skills, right? She brought that violin home, and it was atrocious to hear the noise that thing would make when she first started touching it, right? And it took a while for her to start to get there. And so Eric said that, hey, this DReyfus model, right, you might look at this and say, oh yeah, linear, right? Novice, advanced beginner, competence, or just down the road. And he says, no, in the very beginning, right, when you first start touching that violin, you have no idea what to do, right? It takes a while before you can even start to approach the thing. And so, violin being one example, software another, right? So there's kind of a not very steep slope, right? A flat slope in the beginning, and then it starts to turn up a little bit as you move into advanced beginner territory, right? You've started to learn little things, and then there's a period of rapid skill acquisition. And that was the case with my daughter, right? She started, it was almost magical how it was recognizable as something akin to music, right? Within a few days of her starting to manipulate this violin. And I was like, wow, amazing, right? So there's rapid skill acquisition, right? And so that I think is a little bit like this advanced beginner stage, right? And you can think about competence and proficiency, and those are varying degrees of advancement. Ultimately expert, right? Maybe if you try hard enough, ultimately you'll get to expert, right? And I think there are some arguments that, just keep practicing, right? Some of the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours, right? To mastery kind of a thing. But Eric says, not so fast. Not so fast, right? We've all heard the story about there's a developer over there, right? He's got 20 years of experience. But it's not really 20 years of experience. It's the same 1 year of experience 20 times, right? And I think there's a reason why that makes us smile because, we've all known that guy, right? Maybe we even are that guy. And that's the thing, right? Expert beginner. This is the thing that Eric had in his blog post, linked in that README file that I mentioned as well. And you must read this post by Eric. It's brilliant. So the expert beginner might think he's an expert, right? And the Dunning-Kruger effect kicks in here, right? Dunning-Kruger being the idea that those who don't have proficiency often are the ones who really think that they do, right? And it's conversely, right? People who are sufficiently advanced in something are the most humble about the skills that they have, right? So the expert beginner doesn't know he's not an expert. Eric, in his blog post, it was beautiful. He talked about his experience with learning to bowl, right? The game where you roll the ball down the alley and knock down the pins, right? And he said that he used a very non-standard technique, and that he wouldn't even use the holes. He'd just kind of, use his elbow and huck the thing down the alley. And he said he got pretty good at that, right? And that he could bowl 160s with that, and that was impressive, right? But then he hit that plateau, and he couldn't get any better, right? And the wise sage, the Yoda character in his story, told him that you can get better, okay, but you're going to have to learn how to do it right. And you're going to have to get a lot worse before you get better, because you've got to start over with a whole different technique on doing this thing, right? So read that blog post. It's worth reading. And I think about that too, right? I like to play basketball. And I go into the gym, and maybe I'm playing with some people I don't know, and I just see guys shooting around to warm up. And I look at when they're shooting, right? And I don't care if they make the shot, right? There's guys out there shooting. I look at their form, right? A guy that shoots the ball in a way that looks like he's been coached tells me, well, he's probably been coached, right? If a guy has that classic form that you've come to expect, that you see Steph Curry shooting with, right? That's a guy that's been coached. And I expect that if he's been coached in that aspect of the game, he's been coached in the game. And so because he uses good form when he's shooting, even if he's missing every shot, right? I expect that he's probably going to make the cuts I expect him to make, and he's going to be in those same spots that I expect him to be in, and sometimes I'm surprised, right? But it's a pretty good barometer. It's a pretty good indicator. So, that idea of somebody who has figured out a better way, who has taken on mentorship and grown, that's a lot, I think, what Eric is talking about here in this idea of the expert beginner. So we developers, right, you may be the expert in your context, but have a little humility, right? Remember that you are not necessarily God's gift to programming. Maybe you are, right? I'm not necessarily talking to you, right? I certainly, I have my strengths, but I don't know everything. So, I think that's something to keep in mind when we're pointing fingers at domain experts and saying, dude, you're lacking, right? I wish I could get better answers from my domain expert. Well, yes, we all wish we could, okay? But this is a team effort, and we're trying to get better along with our domain experts. Related to this idea of the expert beginner, a couple of guests on my podcast, right? And Felipe mentioned it, right, that I'm a podcaster, that my Developer on Fire podcast, I interview developers, get them to tell stories, share experiences, all of that kind of stuff. And the two guys that I had on there, Scott Vlashin is actually here, right? One of the things that these guys emphasized was that in coming to functional programming from a more object-oriented approach prior, that they were able to see some things differently, shake themselves out of local maxima, right? A mathematical term, right? Talking about that you've scaled one peak, right? But there may be yet another higher peak that you need to scale. And so this idea of, getting worse before you get better as a bowler, right? To get on a trajectory to reach an even higher point, that was something these guys really emphasized. So those were some episodes that I really took something away from, that idea that, hey, you may like what you're doing, but you can get better. So I think that's related to gaining greater mastery in the realm of software, being better experts, right? We can be better than we are, as well as helping our domain experts get better than they are. So I think maybe a better term than expert, right? We can think about mastery, right? Although I think that too has a bit of a, if you're a master, you are a perfect sage, that kind of thing, right? I really like, though, the way that Dave Thomas, again, right, the authors of the Pragmatic Programmer, that was a hard one for me, right? The authors of the Pragmatic Programmer, there's even a subtitle on the Pragmatic Programmer about your journey to mastery, right? And I think that's a kind of a good way to look at it, right? We're on our way. We're continually improving. I'm not necessarily a master, although in some contexts, right, I'm the most masterful around. So maybe that's a way to think about this. I think another way we can think about domain experts, software experts, practitioners who are valuable in a given context is, are you worth listening to, right? So this idea of that your domain expert has something to say that you don't know about, well, it's in your best interest to listen to them, to hear what they have to say. I put these guys on this slide because Jim Copleen he's an interesting guy. He is an eccentric character who says a lot of things that you hear and you're like, no way, right? He talks about that there is no evidence that writing unit tests and that test-driven development causes reduced defects, causes increased productivity, causes any of the claims that TDD proponents make about it, right? And put him next to Uncle Bob Martin, right? That's a very stark contrast. These guys are good friends. In fact, when Uncle Bob was on my podcast, he said, you should talk to Jim. And I think that's pretty cool. These guys, they're both worth listening to, right? Both worth listening to. And I think that's what we can strive to be as a software expert, a technical expert. That's also what we can think about, this person that, infuriates me, my domain expert, potentially, right? As we're complaining about domain experts with incomplete knowledge, right? Although often the case, right, that you're not complaining about them, that they do have a lot to offer. But I think you can recognize that, hey, this person has something to offer, something worth listening to. I think that's related to that there's this Canadian psychology professor who wrote this book called 12 Rules for Life. For lack of a better term, kind of a self-help book, kind of a life approach kind of a thing. One of those 12 rules was just brilliant, right? I look at this language and I think that this is something that rolls off the tongue in the way that some of the things that come out of Eric Evans's mouth do, right, as well. Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. That, I think, is a pretty good rule for life, a pretty good rule for software development, pretty good rule for interacting, okay? Everybody knows about Dr. Frederick Brooks and the Mythical Man Month, right? His collection of essays about the development of the IBM whatever it was system in the 70s, right? The timeless lessons about software that we learned there, No Silver Bullet and the Mythical Man Month and all of those things. He, later in the 90s, put together another collection of essays in book form called The Design of Designs, or Design of Design, right? I always want to say it plural, but it's not. So in this book, there are a lot of good, wholesome things to get out of this book, but one of them was this story about his being on a project doing some software, and the person that he was doing the project for didn't really know what they want, and there was a lot of back and forth, and he really asserts that his role as a software practitioner in this thing was not only to deliver the thing, but to help the person figure out what it was that they wanted. Brilliant, right? So you're dealing with an expert who doesn't necessarily know everything there is to know about the domain. It's your job to help them figure it out. Okay? So yes, your domain expert is imperfect, right? So are you, but you can help them get better. Okay? So I want to just kind of put a few thoughts, a few tips onto what kind of mindset shift can you go through to try to enable this creative collaboration, right? So just a few things, and these are all related to one another, about how we can think about our interactions, how we can think about our relative degrees of expertise and mastery and authority and all of those kinds of things within the context of the business that we're working with. So the first thing I want to say is, I said this earlier, you're not an expert, right? But you are an expert, right? Within a given bounded context. You have authoritative knowledge, right? Let's just scrap that comprehensive thing, right? You're an expert in a given context. And you need to approach your life, your activity, your contribution as though you are, right? This is, there is a delicate balance between that and the expert beginner, right? Keep in mind that although you are an expert in a given context, right, you haven't reached the pinnacle. And I don't mean to preach at you, right? You, me, right? I haven't reached the pinnacle, right? I'm an expert in some contexts, but I'm an imperfect expert, okay? So the balance between, right, the balance between humility and confidence, that's a delicate line to walk, right? We could have talks about that and wouldn't necessarily be related to domain-driven design, but at the same time it is, right? Everything's related to domain-driven design, right? So that delicate balance, okay? So also consider your domain expert. That person's an expert, right? Saying that there are no experts, right? That falls short because that person has something to offer that you can benefit from, right? So there are no experts, okay, for some definitions of expert, right? But that person is real, they're valuable, and they have something to contribute. So keep that in mind, right? And you can guess what the last one is, right? But, don't expect your domain expert to know everything, right? Check and recheck, right? Trust but verify, right? If you have ways of finding out about your domain outside of just trusting that domain expert, well, you can also learn about your domain, right? You can verify some of these things. You don't have to just take their word for it, right? Of course, they are an expert. They are an authority. They know something, and you need to take that into account, right? So a few actions related to that mindset, right? You might think about those mindset things, print them out, tape them on your bathroom mirror, and tell yourself that every day, right? I'm an expert, right? But I'm not the expert. Some of those kinds of things. So I think that's kind of the mindset shift that I want to push toward here, okay? Some specific actions, some things to do in your daily interactions. Well, this might be obvious, right? It's something that gets preached a lot, listen, right? But what does it mean? What does it mean to listen, right? I think most of the time when somebody else is talking, I'm formulating a response in my mind instead of really fully taking in the full breadth, the full depth of grasping what it is that they're trying to get at, right? So the wheels are turning, and it's human nature, right? It's hard to turn that off, but to the extent that you can, right? You want to try to fully be present in taking in what somebody has to say, right? And listening is not just keeping your mouth shut, right? Sometimes you have to open your mouth to listen, right? Because you need to know more, right? If something is not clear, you need to find out clarity, right? So that's another part of listening, right? So that's not necessarily a separate one, but it is the same thing. Now, this one I love. Aslak Helisoy was a guest on my podcast. He's the creator of Cucumber and one of the co-authors of the Cucumber book, and just an all-around awesome guy as far as interacting, doing the Three Amigos and interacting with folks and understanding the domain of the problem, understanding what it is that your software is supposed to do. When he was on my show, he talked about this shower epiphany, that he came up with this idea that you should test your understanding. That when you and he put it in the context of talking to your children, right? If you tell your kid that something, you give them some instruction, tell them something that they need to know, right? You know that their grasp of language is not what yours is, and you ask them to state back their understanding of it, right? And it's a good way, right? It's a heavy protocol, right? This is a bit the TCP compared to the UDP we usually do, right? Got it, right? That's kind of the acknowledgement that we usually give when somebody says something to it. But no, stating it back in your own words, right? Like you would expect from a child who isn't necessarily a master of language, right? It was awesome. That episode is linked in that README, so I do think that that's worth listening to, right? Speaking of experts, Aslak is certainly one of those. Also, right, you have something to offer, right? Present it as though you have something to offer, right? Wishy-washy, well, maybe, sometimes you don't have full confidence in what you are suggesting, so maybe sometimes you do need to temper it, but confidence goes a long way in being able to argue your points, right? Balance that, though, with don't lie about knowing something you don't, okay? So that's another specific action. I think it might be obvious that you should not claim to know things that you don't. I don't know is a perfectly good answer. I don't know yet is an even better answer, right? I don't know, but I will tomorrow. Even better, okay? And I just like to throw in the Eric Evans here again, right? That when we're speaking with our domain experts, we should be using the language that they're using. We should be learning that language. And I think I'm preaching to the choir at a DDD conference saying that, but that's the gist there, right? Further than that, though, right, even better than all of these things of trying to deal with your domain expert in that way, right, become a domain expert yourself, right? There is nothing stopping you from learning about the business that you're working in, right? If you are working in insurance, you should learn about insurance. And interacting with your domain experts is one way to do that, one of many, and you should certainly be doing that. But you can supplement that with some study of your own and all of those kinds of things. So that's essentially the message that I wanted to say here, right? Experts are real, right? But you need to temper what you mean by that. So a few things I just want to restate here. One is, I think DDD is all about this, right? Communication is not easy, and we have to take great care in trying to talk to one another, whether we're talking about software developers, something else, right? You cannot know everything, right? Nobody knows everything, and you're always going to have gaps in knowledge. The people you're dealing with are going to have gaps in knowledge, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't have something that you can use, right? Comprehensive knowledge is asking too much. So dictionary definition, right? If we're going by that, then yes, there's no experts. And, maybe Eric did us a great service by saying, not necessarily experts, but practitioners. Okay, maybe masters, maybe valuable contributors, right? Language is hard, so expert might be a little bit too high. And then this one, right? You're a technical expert. You can be more than that. You can be more, right? You can also, like Frederick Brooks said, right? It's a part of your job to help your domain experts understand better what it is that they need, right? And you're always evolving your model, right? It's continuously growing, just like you are. So that's the gist of it, right? That is the repository that has the README, that has the links, and also is the slides. And I think we have a couple minutes that we can, questions, comments, those kinds of things. Yeah,
I guess I had a couple reactions.
Sure.
Well, and one, so with listening, I've heard the phrase, listen to understand, don't listen to defend. So that's a good one. And then I guess I don't think comprehensive means perfect. So I'm not looking for someone who has 100% complete understanding. And I would consider my primary care physician an expert.
Sure.
I wouldn't go to him if I didn't think he was an expert, but I don't expect him to know every last thing that there is to know.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we what does comprehensive mean, right? That's right back into this whole language is hard, and well, we'd have to define that term, right? And every time we define a term, we're defining it in other terms, right? So to me, comprehensive means complete, but maybe there are other definitions of that term. We'd have to look that up. But the point still remains that somebody's an expert in a context when they have something to offer, just like your physician does, and your physician probably doesn't know everything, but relative to you, they certainly have a lot to say.
Any other questions?
I don't know if it's a question, more of a comment. I think you talked about learning other people's languages, learning the domains. That's very important because when you learn definition meanings within your own context and also within other people's context, you actually get a better understanding of your original context. As an example, at one point in time, I learned a foreign language, and by learning that language, I actually learned what English words meant. I had no idea what the English word meant until I learned a foreign language, which is kind of interesting too.
Brilliant. Yeah, that was one of the things that both Scott Vlashin and Dave Thomas said when they were on my show was that learning functional programming taught them better ways of doing object-oriented programming, right? So it's a very similar idea there that, learning something in those other domains. And speaking the language of the domain, right, it's critical because, we get into these things where, and service is the example I always use, right? Terms that have so many meanings that they have no meaning. And it's the same way in your domain, right? I've dealt with systems where there was a concept of an application that somebody fills out, right? And and application was used to mean different things in different contexts, right? And that's okay, right? It's good to have different contexts where you can use those things in different ways, but we didn't have those explicit boundaries on those contexts, and so nobody knew what you were talking about when you said application. So yeah, using those terms, getting consistent on meaning the same thing with the same way, at least when you're in a given context, it's one of kind of to me the key takeaways of the Blue Book.
Any other questions? Oh, thank you very much.